Scott Bernstein is the founder, co-founder of, and current director of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, CNT, which is based in New York, based in Chicago, and is been going strong for how many years? 37 years, wow. And it's an amazing organization with a lot of staff and a lot of people doing incredibly cool things related to neighborhood promotions. So, of course, he's absolutely a key figure to have in this discussion.
I started out at Northwestern University at the Center for Urban Affairs and Policy Research, and I really had the urge to do something about, back in the mid-'70s, the stuff we were studying. And so we created a Center for Neighborhood Technology to, today we say, to make sustainable communities for everybody attainable. That's the mission. And it's hard because we're held to a high standard. We're held to a standard that the knowledge that sits behind our program designs meet the equivalent of an academic standard in many cases, particularly if we're being asked to change policy or provide better decision support. And it's also hard because it's impossible to simply organize a program or a project or a system of the same at the neighborhood level if what you're up against is in fact larger changes that are happening at the scale of metropolitan region or a state or a multi-state region or global changes. And so the way we do our work today is quite different than we did in the 70s. One thing that's changed, and I know a number of you remember this, in the mid-70s, people were running away from cities as fast as they could. Today, it seems to be the other way around. We had a standing inventory in 1977 of 150,000 abandoned units, growing by 10,000 units a year for reasons similar to what George talked about, among others, and we had gotten up to demolishing 7,000 units a year with a promise to get rid of all of the ones that were abandoned. So these are quite different sorts of times. And I think the imperative of a chaotic climate is now matched by the imperative of an equally chaotic economy. And the question, I think, on what to do with the uncertainty that this presents to people who would improve the quality of life and the quality of the economy as it affects neighborhoods and the people that live in them, is forced into reuse this old word of resilience. And the question of, in fact, whether we're adaptive enough and smart enough to be adapted enough, fast enough to roll with the punches or get beyond them or create a more stable sort of economy. So what I'd like to do is reflect a little bit as I go through some slides to help focus this on what I heard and try and wrap it up, if I can move fast enough, with some underlining and underscoring of things that I heard, some things that I question whether they're true, and maybe a recommendation, Emily, for future forums on this, if that's okay. So let's move ahead. This is a quote from Governor Kitzhaber from Oregon in a meeting I was in with him in 2012. He says, "As governments, we're on the hook to maintain our core legacy infrastructure." And that means roads, bridges, water, and sewers. And he said, but then there's the infrastructure we're turned on about: mass transit, more complete streets, clean energy economy, broadband, smart grid, and green infrastructure. How do we get enough of that fast enough? How do we make it work for everybody? And I think that simple observation is really important. And the choices that are implied, for example, by his talking about infrastructure that way are moving profoundly beyond the kinds of standardized infrastructure that Richard Harris talked about a few minutes ago into perhaps new service bundles or new ways of providing old things, or maybe new services altogether. For a century, we've learned how to bottle rainstorms and treat them as wastewater. Rainwater is legally a waste product when it hits the surface everywhere in the United States, which is sort of ridiculous if you think about conditions today. And we've proven that catching raindrops where they fall and put them to work can not only green the city and make it more beautiful, but can recharge the ecosystem and do all sorts of other wonderful things. Streets moving from streets to maximize traffic and speed and throughput to streets that connect people in what they do routinely. We just heard an eloquent statement about from Liz Plater-Zyberg. Bypassing communities with long-distance highway and aviation, sometimes just in the pure service of globalization, could be replaced with reconnecting communities, whether with intercity rail or other sorts of sensible connections. 35 years ago, the idea was floated that we couldn't afford to keep expanding electric service everywhere in the face of droughts in the Northwest, in the face of new environmental standards. Perhaps it would make more sense to pay communities and customers to be more efficient. And today, almost everywhere in America except this room, you can count on more efficient lighting, for example, than what we had then, and more fundamental changes as well. Do we expand car ownership, or do we design communities that come with local amenities and shared vehicles? And in general, do we stop investing to promote consumption and perhaps invest to increase productivity and resilience and reduce the cost of living? In effect, to make communities seen as the source of the productivity, in which case neighborhoods aren't just real estate and a place to sleep at night, and they aren't just the next leg up on the ladder of entertainment centers, perhaps, but they're destinations for much more fundamental reasons as well as origins. And let's talk about some of the trends that may be forcing consideration of that. This is data from 1929 to 2012 in Chicago. I was coached on how to do this by Don Woobles, who was the head of the US part of the IPCC. This measures annual heating degree days and annual cooling degree days, a measure of weather severity versus comfort. And what it says is that we expect warmer winters than we used to have and warmer summers. And one is driving less demand for natural gas and doing so slower than the increase in the rate of demand for electricity for cooling. What's interesting is that both trends end up with more wet stuff falling from the sky. One of these lines is rainfall, and the other one is snow. It's not even, first of all, so you can't count on how much snow you're going to have or rain from year to year or month to month, and it's more chaotic than it used to be, but it's growing. We're going to get a warmer, and we already have a warmer and a wetter world predictively, and we don't have infrastructure that can handle that. With these rates of increase, the multi-billion-dollar deep tunnel and reservoir program being built in Chicago will be obsolete by the time it's finished 15 years from now. And yet there does not seem to be a procedure by which one can politely go in and petition for reconsideration. Andres and I spent a lot of time on this Lean Urbanism Council trying to identify either workarounds or a way to shine a light on bureaucratic idiocy where it exists and replace it with common sense. And it's hard enough on an individual building project scale. Suppose the whole region wakes up and finds itself committed to really big, lumpy, old stuff that's being sold as bright, shiny, new, state-of-the-art 1910 technology. And in a sense, that's what we're being given, and it's driving an increase in the cost of living, as we'll see in a moment. The economy has a similar sort of problem. GDP per capita, which isn't a great measure, but it's what we've got, it shows us that over time, not all places ride with the punches equally, and not all places recover as quickly. We've known for some time that older cities are not recovering as quickly as newer cities. We don't know how much of that is measurement error and how much of it is real, but we do know that it's forcing us to pay attention to doing something more than a prayer meeting to try and distribute the benefits of something that we call recovery. Chicago likes to pride itself on being a top real estate market. For the last 5 years, it hasn't even ranked in the top 20 markets surveyed by PricewaterhouseCoopers and ULI based on surveys of the nation's leading investors, developers, and builders. We've just clawed our way up from 24 to 2021. So it looks pretty good downtown. It looks pretty good in Hyde Park and Lincoln Park and a few other places. And when you ask people why not, they say, well, it's hard to build the stuff we want to build. What do you want to build? Well, we've been tracking these demographic trends. We've got a whopping increase in millennials and a whopping increase in older people, and they don't want to drive. They want to walk or ride mass transit, and it's hard to build the kind of transit-oriented development everywhere that we want. So a city or a whole region, by its policies, can deny the innovations and the access to capital. One of the things that we've been able to show with peer-reviewed research now is that whereas, let's say, from 2000 to 2009, income rose around 22% here, the cost of housing rose 30%, but the cost of transportation rose 38%. The cost of transportation rose faster than housing almost everywhere in America, except in the most location-efficient parts of regions, the places where people could walk, where they had local convenience and regional accessibility. Now, on the last discussion of gentrification, it's happening in some places, it's not happening in others. Where it's happening in some places, it's causing displacement or contributing to displacement, and in some places it's simply providing a better mix of incomes. But what's disturbing here is in Chicago and most other major cities is that poverty is growing faster in suburban counties now than it is in core counties, indicating that there is displacement going on. And as a previous speaker indicated, going on and displacing to places that just don't have the supports that the traditional communities that people are displaced from have. Transportation. We now know that we can decouple the growth in the economy from the growth in vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle miles traveled as a whole are not only dropping, but per capita are dropping even faster and have been doing so since at least 2006, a little earlier than that in Chicago. And again, we're able to show that this varies within regions by the quality of choice. So people are driving less. Where they can, they're taking transit more or walking more or biking, or they're taking one of the new options associated with what's now called shared use mobility. This is car sharing and bike sharing and van pooling and shared parking, and making more out of doing something together than separately. And yet, even in a place like Chicago, they're still missing gaps in these systems, particularly on the regional connectivity front. So the biggest job center in the Chicago region is the Loop downtown. That does have excellent regional access and connectivity. The next four are in the suburbs, and none of them are on the rail network, none of them in Chicago. So the problem's there. You not only have to provide transit, but you have to make it easy, I think, is what a number of speakers in the last 24 hours said, to develop and infill and operate near transit. And here we comped Chicago versus the other major regions with mass transit: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco Bay Area. Los Angeles isn't obviously as good as those others yet, but in 10 years they will be, because they're building out a full system faster than anybody else on the planet right now. And what we found was that if you compared the rate of household growth within a half mile of those transit stops to the region as a whole, it's growing faster near the transit stops everywhere but in Chicago. So it's possible to have the asset and not make the most of it, which is another sort of problem, and that leaves neighborhoods behind. It's not a choice that anybody made. Nobody voted for it. It's an inadequate ability to participate in the market and capture the benefits, which is another sort of problem. I'm going to walk you in the next few slides through something that we have had some luck with, which is to redefine housing affordability. When I started this research, I was sure, as a trained political scientist, there was a committee somewhere that created this definition of how to measure how affordable a neighborhood was, or whether a person could make an affordable housing choice based on the ratio of housing cost to income. I never found the committee. What I found was the last line of an Old English poem, which went a week's wage for a month's rent. Well, think about it. That's a quarter of income, and hence the old rule of thumb. And now you too know 100% of the hard science behind measuring housing affordability. So back when that really took off, kids in home ec around the world, including Chicago, were taught, keep your car fare to 3% of your income, and don't you ever go into debt for an automobile. And well, car fare was streetcar fare, and the streetcars eventually disappeared. Now kids are taught differently because home ec was replaced by driver's ed in the schools, and kids are taught exactly how to go into debt for an automobile, and it's called financial responsibility, to add insult to injury. So we thought, what if you were to measure the cost of the sum of housing and transportation costs to income, and what might that tell us? Well, what we found was a logical explanation of what the realtors call drive until you qualify, that if you couldn't afford the house you wanted somewhere near the center of town, you started going a little further out and a little further out, and that red line at a certain point would drop, usually 10 to 15 miles out. But at that point, what they weren't measuring was the cost of transportation started going up, because while it might be statistically possible to own 1.1 cars per household, as a real family, you'd go from 1 all the way to 2 or 3 real cars. And all of a sudden, people found themselves saddled with debt they hadn't planned for. Banks found themselves saddled with loans that weren't working out because of it. We took measurements on 45 variables related to urban form, the stuff that Liz was talking about and others, transportation access, created curves like this for every metropolitan and micropolitan area at the block group level in the United States. That's Chicago and New York, and created this website, which is open source, and you're welcome to use it, htaindex.org for data access. And what we found was sort of this mirror image. Wherever density and accessibility in urban form was high, vehicle miles traveled per household and car ownership was low, which meant that affordability would change according to the quality of the urban space. The map on the left, this is Chicago, is the equivalent of the official HUD map of where a household earning median income can afford to keep their housing costs at 30% of income or below. Most of the map is coded yellow, which means it's affordable. On the map on the right, we've asked the question, where can that same household keep their housing plus transportation costs at 45% of income or below? And the yellow has shrunk up. It's shrunk up around activity centers, walkable places, areas that are regionally connected by mass transit. The same data tells us that where location efficiency is high, greenhouse gas emissions is low. You can code it using one of DPZ's transects there and find that the closer you get to pure urban form, the lower those blue bars are in terms of metric tons of carbon per household per year. This index has now been adopted as sort of a parallel universe index by the secretaries of HUD and DOT. If you go to something called ABOGO, A-B-O-G-O, .cnt.org, you can walk around and find out what your risk is of paying too much for transportation now and emitting too much. The sequence is for Metro Columbus, Ohio. People are spending $781 a month downtown and a little bit more at the OSU campus. It goes up to $1,200 in Westerville, and they're spending $1,300 a month in New Albany, a allegedly well-planned community. Similar sort of sequence here. I couldn't resist comparing University of Chicago to Northwestern. Northwestern came out $50 ahead, but Blue Island, Illinois, much worse, even though it's transit-oriented, because the location-efficient part is very small. And this is Huntley, Illinois, a lifestyle retirement community. A lot of money went into planning it, but everybody drives everywhere. And that's why it's all coded red. So one comment I have with respect to the things that I heard a lot about indicators of risk associated with your zip code could determine your life expectancy, your environmental risk, your lack of social cohesion, but your address might also tell you how location efficient and affordable your place is if you knew something about it. And the difference between perceiving neighborhoods as bundles of problems versus bundles of amenities, or rather the need to plan for reducing one and increasing the other, I think would be a helpful addition, Emily, if you run this conference again. How do we do both at once? How do we merge the research so that the findings here become diagnostics on what to fix? How do we link it with practitioner work on who's trying to fix it and which of these things is most likely to deal with the problems that are found? We asked the question, because of the recent foreclosure crisis, could those maps predict where foreclosures were actually happening? And what we found was kind of amazing. The top graph is 26-week moving averages of gasoline prices in Chicago over a decade or so, spanning pre and post foreclosure period, and the bottom line, the purple line, same periods of time for closure filings. And basically the two shapes are identical with a 6 to 9 month lag. It's if somebody did something like this to the economy and something happened. It took a little while for people to give up in some cases on their homes, or for banks to get avaricious. And we found that foreclosure rates dropped with transit connectivity and increased with VMT over 15,000 miles a year, and those turned out to be those same places. This tells you that gas prices, when they spiked, only rose 3% in the most location-efficient places, but rose 3 times as much in the places that were more exposed because people didn't have choice. This was used at one point for an experimental mortgage program called location-efficient mortgages that worked out. 300 mortgages tracked over an 8-year period, 1 default, 0 foreclosures, and outperformed the market. Fannie Mae saw that and said, thank you, and we're not interested, right? I mean, it's not like there was any court of law for looking at what the best possible public policy fix was for the problems once they'd become apparent. So it's really important to make sure that, I know you gave me the 5 minutes, I'm gonna run 1 minute over. So on resource use, Chicago pioneered the modern comprehensive greenhouse gas reduction plan in 2005 when Mayor Daley was still in office, and we had the privilege of doing the mitigation part of the plan along with some very good scientists who did adaptation, and we are seeing progress in the places where we've invested. So we've invested a lot in greener buildings, and we're seeing progress in that. We've invested almost nothing in better transportation outside of the core area, and we're seeing a growth in greenhouse gas emissions in the very places where they're already the highest. Land consumption is going down, but we're still continuing to sprawl here. Our surface cover looks modestly green, but in just a recent 5-year period, we've lost grass and herb cover, tree and shrub cover, increased building cover, increased road cover, increased impervious surfaces. What we found when the 2 largest insurers in the country and FEMA agreed to share data with us on a question nobody else had apparently asked, which was, where are people filing damage claims from? Now, the assumption was that those floodplain maps tells you where the risks are. Where it turned out the risk was the most imperviously covered places, where you had the most flood exposure and the most risk. So this would suggest maybe communities and developers and current residents should be paid for doing things like this, turning parkways into places that can suck up rain, turning paving in things like alleys, which previously would look like that, into things that would look after like that, and avoid a whole world of pain instead of digging a bigger hole in the ground. Again, I think whether it's on the right to have affordable housing or perhaps develop it ourselves at a neighborhood scale, or the right to exercise choices, maybe through a more distributed kinds of technologies. And I think that's what Doug Farr was talking about towards the end of his talk when he mentioned eco-districts too quickly. Maybe it's time to restudy whether all neighborhoods should have standardized types of infrastructure. Maybe we should experiment with providing services that are only on a single building basis or only regionally right now to match the scale of the neighborhood if in fact that's where the best bang for the buck would be. So if you try and measure, Liz asked about performance measures, and I'm glad she did, how public agencies actually measure the performance, in this case, of transportation investments. When we surveyed DOTs across the country at the state level, they said, well, we're interested in system condition and performance, which means how smooth the pavement is the bridge crumbling or not. We're interested in cost effectiveness, which turned out to be, in English, how much traffic is moving, how quickly, and what are the average travel speeds, and what does that do for you economically in terms of time not wasted. But when you ask local community leaders, mayors, local elected officials, what's important, you got a totally different set of answers. We got regional economic development, which meant cost of living impacts, value creation, value capture, fiscal impacts, quality of supply chain, quality of environment for new business, and then finally livability. So it's like there's two totally different worlds out there. And this infrastructure world that I'm talking about is the regional economy in a sense. It's what's being invested in without much choice being exercised. Bad choices are saddling us with a very, very high tab. And finally, for something completely different, I want to talk about one urban form that wasn't mentioned, which had to do with mixed use with industrial character. When you ask the question of the shipping industry, what's more important going forward, long distance or shorter distance, they tell you unequivocally it's a global market. And that's what those lines on the left say. But these bars tell you that everywhere you look, the percentage of traffic, freight tonnage moving less than 50 miles is somewhere between 48 and 72%. So a couple of miles west of here, 100 years ago, the Central Manufacturing District was developed by the owners of Chicago stockyards to see if they could match both global shipping needs with local shipping needs. And they built a kind of amazing development that interfaced with the community, with planned development. Those buildings, they're on Pershing Avenue, are gorgeous. You could walk in and out of each one of them. There weren't guards in front of them. There wasn't a single gate. The offices were in front, the light manufacturing and distribution in back, the rail, and then heavy manufacturing unders were sort of a transect for industry. And this is significant because this was the pilot industrial park in the whole world. Industrial areas weren't planned, and when they were planned with big gates around them in the early forms. This was something that said people ought to be able to walk to work, and those are the plats showing the adjacency with Brighton Park and McKinley Park. And it was a rail-oriented sort of thing, and it worked, and it's coming back. I don't have time to go through the slides on how certain suburbs around here are actually taking this lesson to heart again with work that we've been doing in Blue Island and Harvey and Riverdale and other places. And cities around the country are asking, is there a way to capture industrial development again and put people back to work and in effect make the things that we're consuming. And it's too late to put the global genie, I think, back in the bottle, but I think that it's possible that we can evolve cities to be productive places again. Now, none of the research papers, as I heard them, actually addressed this issue. Is there a continued purpose of the sort that cities have traditionally had? You know, I hate to say it because I did work for the guys, but Bill Clinton and Al Gore used to say, do people want cheaper costs of living? Well, we can get it by increasing global connections to the economy. And, you know, we ended up sort of looking the other way while the lifeblood of cities got diffused. And I don't think that the services economy by itself is going to provide the opportunity for the kinds of poverty problems that we have. In Memphis, this kind of analysis is being used right now, this afternoon, in a meeting between the mayor of Memphis and the secretaries of HUD and DOT for a proposed poverty reduction initiative that would target the benefits of all this efficiency. So to reflect on what I heard and summarize, I think that if we can use the knowledge creating work that goes on in academic research to identify whether what we're proposing provides a pathway to economic inclusion and economic participation, sort of a democratization of the economy, then there's a future for neighborhood and community. And if we can't do it, then we're sort of stuck trying to find a way to make a certain quality of residential life affordable without reaching the bigger goal. I think the design work, on the other hand, that Doug and Liz and Andres and the Congress for New Urbanism have, is setting the table for that broader economic inclusion, but as yet hasn't connected, I think, to the economic forces meaningfully that also have to be in this discussion. And that makes this, I think, a nice setup for the agenda for the rest of this. So I guess I'll stop right there and see if there's any questions. Thank you very much.